behind the golden gates of Windsor Castle, where protocol rules every breath and cameras capture every smile, a moment of raw human emotion erupted that would forever change how the world viewed the royal family. What happens when the pressure of perfection meets the reality of family dynamics? When Queen Camilla's patience finally snapped at 8-year-old Princess Charlotte during a seemingly routine royal event, nobody expected the response that would come from the most unlikely source. This isn't just another royal scandal. It's the story of how a single exchange between a step-grandmother and granddaughter revealed the cracks beneath the crown, and how one royal guard's 9 words would become the most talked-about moment in modern royal history. In a world where every royal gesture is rehearsed and every word is measured, sometimes the most powerful moments come from the most unexpected places. The cameras were rolling, the world was watching, and nobody was prepared for what happened next. The morning sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured grounds of Windsor Castle as preparations began for what should have been a routine charity garden party. Queen Camilla stood at the grand window of the blue drawing room, adjusting her pearl necklace for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. The weight of the crown jewels felt heavier today, though she wore only her wedding ring and the simple pearl strand that had become her signature. Below in the courtyard, staff members hurried back and forth, setting up white pavilion tents and arranging tables with military precision. The Children's Hospital charity event was one of Camilla's personal initiatives, and she had spent weeks ensuring every detail would be perfect. The guest list included prominent donors, hospital staff, and several young patients who would be meeting members of the royal family for the first time. Princess Charlotte had been excited about the event for days. At 8 years old, she possessed a natural charm that made her a favorite at public appearances. Her parents, Prince William and Catherine, had carefully prepared her for today's responsibilities. She would help distribute small gifts to the visiting children and participate in a ceremonial tree planting that would commemorate the hospital's new wing. The morning had started smoothly. Charlotte arrived at Windsor Castle with her nanny, Maria Theresa, wearing a powder blue dress that matched her eyes and small white gloves that made her feel very grown-up. She practiced her curtsy in the mirror and rehearsed the short speech she would give when presenting flowers to the hospital's head nurse. Camilla greeted Charlotte warmly in the morning room, where they shared tea and biscuits while reviewing the day's schedule. Everything seemed perfectly arranged. The photographer had been briefed on the best angles for family photos, the security team had cleared all protocols, and even the weather had cooperated with gentle sunshine and mild breezes. However, beneath the surface of royal perfection, tensions had been building for weeks. Camilla was still adjusting to her role as queen consort, feeling the constant scrutiny of a public that remained divided about her place in the monarchy. Every gesture was analyzed. Every interaction with William's children was dissected by royal watchers and critics alike. The pressure to be the perfect step-grandmother while maintaining royal dignity had become increasingly exhausting. Charlotte, meanwhile, was experiencing her own growing pains as a young royal. The 8-year-old was naturally spirited and curious, qualities that didn't always align with the rigid expectations of royal protocol. Her parents tried to balance giving her a normal childhood with preparing her for future royal duties, but Charlotte sometimes struggled with the constant reminders to sit straight, speak quietly, and never show too much emotion in public. The first sign of trouble came during the morning briefing with the palace's protocol officer, Sir James Whitmore. He explained to Charlotte that she must walk exactly 3 steps behind Queen Camilla during the garden tour, curtsy before speaking to each guest, and remember to keep her hands clasped behind her back when not actively participating in activities. Charlotte listened politely, but asked why she couldn't walk beside her step-grandmother like she did with her own grandmother. Sir James explained that royal hierarchy must be observed at all times, especially during public events. Charlotte nodded, but her bright smile dimmed slightly. As the guests began arriving, Charlotte positioned herself in the reception line, as instructed. She greeted each visitor with perfect manners, her curtsy precise, and her smile genuine. The young patients from the hospital were particularly excited to meet her, and Charlotte's natural warmth shone through as she asked about their favorite subjects in school and their pets at home. Everything proceeded smoothly until they reached the garden pavilion where Charlotte was supposed to present the ceremonial flowers. The head nurse, Mrs. Patricia Davies, was a warm woman in her 50s who had dedicated her life to caring for sick children. She approached Charlotte with obvious delight, and Charlotte impulsively stepped forward to give her a hug instead of the planned formal handshake. Camilla's sharp intake of breath was audible to those nearby. In that moment, years of protocol training and weeks of careful event planning seemed to unravel. Charlotte's spontaneous gesture, while heartwarming, broke several rules of royal etiquette. Physical contact with members of the public was strictly limited, and any deviation from the rehearsed program could set unwelcome precedents. The cameras captured every second of the exchange. Mrs. Davies looked surprised, but pleased by Charlotte's warmth. The gathered crowd murmured approvingly at the young princess's genuine kindness. But Camilla's face had gone rigid with barely controlled frustration. The moment passed quickly, and the event continued with the tree planting ceremony. Charlotte helped shovel soil around the young oak tree, while photographers captured images of 3 generations of royals working together. But those closest to the queen consort noticed the tension in her shoulders and the forced quality of her smile. After the tree planting, there was supposed to be a brief, informal mingling period where Charlotte could speak more freely with the visiting children. This was the part of the day Charlotte had been most excited about. She loved hearing stories from other children and was genuinely curious about their experiences in the hospital. As Charlotte chatted animatedly with a 7-year-old boy about his collection of toy cars, her voice gradually rose with enthusiasm. She forgot about the earlier reminder to speak quietly and began gesturing expressively as she described her own favorite toys. Her laughter rang out across the garden as the boy shared a funny story about his pet hamster. Camilla watched from several feet away, her jaw tightening with each passing moment. The queen consort was acutely aware of the photographers documenting every interaction, the television cameras broadcasting live to millions of viewers, and the social media posts already beginning to spread across the internet. In her mind, Charlotte's behavior, while charming to observers, represented a dangerous lack of the dignified restraint that royal children were expected to maintain. The breaking point came when Charlotte, caught up in the joy of making new friends, spontaneously suggested that all the children should have a running race across the garden lawn. The young patients cheered with excitement, and several began moving toward the open grass area before their parents and hospital staff could intervene. That was the moment when Queen Camilla's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. She strode across the garden with purpose, her heels clicking sharply against the stone pathway. The assembled guests sensed the shift in atmosphere immediately, conversations quieting as all attention focused on the approaching queen consort. Charlotte looked up from organizing her impromptu race with innocent excitement still shining in her eyes. She had no idea that her spontaneous idea had created what Camilla saw as a potential security nightmare and a complete breakdown of royal protocol. In Charlotte's mind, she was simply trying to make the visiting children happy and give them a memorable experience. The collision between Camilla's mounting frustration and Charlotte's exuberant innocence was about to create a moment that would be remembered for years to come. As Camilla reached Charlotte's side, her voice carried a sharp edge that had never before been directed at any of the royal children in such a public setting. The garden party that had begun with such promise was about to take a turn that no amount of royal protocol training could have prepared anyone for. Queen Camilla's voice cut through the cheerful chatter of the garden party like ice through silk. "Princess Charlotte, that is quite enough." The words carried a sharpness that made several nearby guests turn their heads in surprise. Charlotte looked up at her step-grandmother with confusion clouding her bright blue eyes, still holding the small flag she had planned to use as a starting signal for the children's race. "But we were just going to have a little fun," Charlotte said softly, her voice carrying the innocent bewilderment of a child who couldn't understand why making others happy could be wrong. The group of young hospital patients stood frozen between excitement and uncertainty, sensing the sudden tension but not understanding its source. Camilla's face had taken on the stern expression she typically reserved for difficult diplomatic meetings. "This is not the time or place for such behavior," she said firmly, her voice carrying across the garden with unmistakable authority. "Royal children do not organize playground activities during official events. You should know better." The rebuke hung in the air like a storm cloud. Charlotte's face flushed pink with embarrassment as she realized that dozens of eyes were watching their exchange. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every nuance of emotion that crossed the 8-year-old's face. She clutched the small flag tighter, her knuckles white against the wooden handle. Mrs. Davies, the head nurse, stepped forward with the wisdom of someone who had spent decades working with children. "Your Majesty, the children were simply excited to meet Princess Charlotte. Perhaps we could channel that enthusiasm into the scheduled activities." Her voice was respectful, but carried a gentle attempt to defuse the situation. Camilla's response was swift and left no room for negotiation. "The schedule exists for important reasons, and it will be followed precisely." She turned her attention back to Charlotte, her voice dropping to a tone that was meant to be private, but carried clearly in the garden's acoustics. "Your behavior today has been consistently inappropriate. First the unauthorized physical contact, then the loud outbursts, and now this complete disregard for protocol." Charlotte's eyes began to fill with tears, though she fought valiantly to maintain her composure. The young princess had never been spoken to so harshly in such a public setting. Even during private family corrections, the tone had never carried such cold disapproval. She looked around desperately, hoping to spot her nanny Maria Teresa or someone who might offer comfort, but found only staring faces and pointing cameras. "I was just trying to be nice," Charlotte whispered, her voice barely audible. The small flag slipped from her loosened grip and fluttered to the ground between them. Camilla's frustration had been building for weeks, fed by constant criticism in the press, pressure from palace advisors, and her own insecurities about her role within the royal family. Seeing Charlotte's tears should have triggered her maternal instincts, but instead, it seemed to fuel her sense that the situation was spiraling completely out of control. "Nice is not the priority here," Camilla said with finality. "Royal duty and proper behavior are what matter. You are representing the crown, not playing at a birthday party." The words carried a bitter edge that surprised even some of the palace staff who had worked with Camilla for years. The garden had fallen almost completely silent. The young hospital patients watched with wide eyes as their special day took an unexpected turn. Their parents shuffled uncomfortably, uncertain whether they should intervene, look away, or continue watching this unprecedented public family drama unfold. Charlotte stood frozen for a moment, processing the harsh words and the hostile tone. Then, with the unpredictable honesty that only children possess, she responded in a voice that carried clearly across the garden. "You're being mean, and you're not even my real grandmother." The gasps from the assembled guests were audible. Several photographers adjusted their positions to capture better angles of the confrontation. Social media notifications were already beginning to ping on phones throughout the crowd as early reports of the incident spread online. Camilla's face went pale, then flushed deep red. The words hit her like a physical blow, striking directly at her deepest insecurities about her place in the royal family and her relationship with William's children. For a moment, she seemed to deflate slightly, the rigid posture softening as the hurt registered in her eyes. But the damage was done, and Camilla's next words came from a place of wounded pride rather than rational thought. "Your real grandmother would be ashamed of your behavior today," she said sharply, referring to the late Princess Diana in a way that crossed every possible line of family decency and public appropriateness. The effect was immediate and devastating. Charlotte's tears, which had been threatening to spill, now flowed freely down her cheeks. The mention of her grandmother Diana, whom she had never met but heard spoken of with such love and reverence, delivered in such a cruel context, was more than the 8-year-old could bear. Sir James Whitmore, the protocol officer, stepped forward with obvious distress. "Your Majesty, perhaps we should move this discussion to a more private setting?" His voice carried the diplomatic urgency of someone trying to prevent a disaster from becoming a catastrophe. But before Camilla could respond, before Charlotte could flee to find comfort, and before any adult could take control of the rapidly deteriorating situation, a new voice entered the conversation. Captain James Morrison had been standing at his post near the garden entrance, maintaining the professional invisibility that royal protection officers perfected over years of service. He was a decorated military veteran who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the Royal Protection Detail. His role was to observe, protect, and remain silent unless directly addressed or unless security was threatened. Morrison had watched the entire exchange with growing discomfort. He had 2 daughters of his own, ages 6 and 10, and Charlotte's tears triggered every protective instinct he had developed as both a father and a soldier. More importantly, he had served the royal family for 8 years and had deep respect for the institution they represented. What he had just witnessed wasn't royal discipline or protocol enforcement. It was an adult taking out her frustrations on a child in the cruelest possible way. The mention of Princess Diana in such a context crossed every line of decency that Morrison recognized, both as a royal protection officer and as a human being. Morrison stepped forward from his position, his military bearing evident in every measured step. His movement caught the attention of everyone in the garden, as royal protection officers never left their posts without serious reason. The cameras turned toward him, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "Excuse me, Your Majesty," Morrison said, his voice carrying the calm authority of his military training. His words were respectful, but firm, cutting through the tension like a sword through silk. Camilla turned toward him with surprise and obvious irritation. Royal protection officers were part of the invisible machinery that made royal events function smoothly. They were not supposed to insert themselves into family conversations or public interactions unless security was at stake. "Captain Morrison, return to your post immediately," Camilla commanded, her voice sharp with the assumption that her authority would be instantly obeyed. Morrison stood perfectly straight, his eyes meeting Camilla's directly. In that moment, 8 years of silent service and unwavering loyalty were balanced against his duty to protect what the monarchy represented at its best. He thought of his own daughters, of the young hospital patients watching this unfold, and of the little girl crying because an adult had failed to protect her innocence. The garden held its breath as Captain Morrison prepared to speak the 9 words that would change everything. Captain Morrison's voice remained steady and respectful, but his words carried the weight of absolute moral clarity. "Ma'am, that's a child who needs protecting, not attacking." The 9 words landed in the garden's silence like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread outward through the assembled crowd. Every camera captured Morrison's face as he spoke, his military bearing unchanged, but his eyes reflecting the conviction of someone who had crossed a line he could never uncross. Camilla stood frozen, her mouth slightly open in shock. In 8 years of royal protection service, no officer had ever directly challenged her behavior, let alone in such a public setting. The breach of protocol was unprecedented, but Morrison's calm dignity made his words impossible to dismiss as mere insubordination. Charlotte stopped crying and looked up at the tall officer who had stepped forward to defend her. She didn't fully understand the magnitude of what had just happened, but she recognized kindness when she saw it. Morrison's intervention had created a pocket of safety in what had become a hostile environment. The reaction from the crowd was immediate but varied. Several of the hospital staff nodded in obvious agreement with Morrison's words. Mrs. Davies reached out instinctively to place a gentle hand on Charlotte's shoulder, finally providing the comfort the child desperately needed. Some of the donors and dignitaries looked uncomfortable, uncertain how to process this unprecedented breakdown of royal decorum. Sir James Whitmore stepped forward quickly, his diplomatic training kicking in as he attempted to regain control of the situation. "Perhaps we should move inside for refreshments," he announced loudly, hoping to redirect everyone's attention and give the principals time to regroup away from the cameras. But the damage had been done, and everyone present knew they had witnessed something historic. Morrison's defense of Charlotte had transformed a private family squabble into a public statement about the values that should guide the monarchy. The protection officer had essentially declared that protecting children from adult cruelty was more important than maintaining hierarchical silence. Camilla found her voice first, though it shook slightly with barely controlled rage. "Captain Morrison, you are relieved of duty immediately. Report to your supervisor for disciplinary action." Her words carried the authority of her position, but they sounded hollow after Morrison's moral challenge. Morrison nodded once, accepting the consequences of his choice without apparent regret. "Understood, Your Majesty. I'll escort Princess Charlotte to safety first, if I may." His request was framed respectfully, but it carried an implicit criticism of Camilla's failure to prioritize the child's well-being. Before Camilla could respond, Charlotte surprised everyone by walking directly to Morrison and taking his hand. The gesture was small, but profound, an 8-year-old's instinctive recognition of who had truly protected her when protection was needed most. The image of the crying princess holding hands with a royal protection officer who had risked his career to defend her would become one of the most powerful photographs in modern royal history. It captured everything the public wanted the monarchy to represent: strength used to protect innocence, duty placed above personal comfort, and moral courage in the face of institutional pressure. Maria Theresa, Charlotte's nanny, finally reached the group after pushing through the crowd. She immediately knelt beside Charlotte, offering the comfort that should have come from family. Her presence reminded everyone that this was still a child who needed care and protection, not punishment and public humiliation. The hospital patients and their families were quietly led away by staff members who understood that the planned meet and greet had become something entirely different. Many of the children asked their parents why the princess was crying and why the grown-ups were being mean to her. Their innocent questions highlighted the fundamental wrongness of what had transpired. As word of the incident spread beyond the garden party, the response was swift and decisive. Social media exploded with support for both Charlotte and Morrison. The hashtag #ProtectOurPrincess began trending within hours, accompanied by widespread criticism of Camilla's behavior. Morrison was hailed as a hero who had put child welfare above royal politics. Within the palace walls, emergency meetings were called as senior advisors tried to manage the crisis. The Queen's private secretary worked frantically to craft a response that could minimize the damage to the monarchy's reputation. However, the incident had been too public and too clearly captured on camera to be easily explained away. Prince William and Catherine were informed immediately and rushed to Windsor Castle to collect Charlotte. Their arrival added another layer of tension to an already explosive situation. William's face was grim as he surveyed the scene and learned what had happened to his daughter. The confrontation between William and Camilla that followed occurred behind closed doors, but palace staff reported raised voices and heated exchanges that continued for over an hour. Catherine focused entirely on comforting Charlotte, who had been traumatized by the public confrontation and confused by the adult dynamics she couldn't fully understand. Morrison was escorted from the premises as protocol demanded, but his exit was filmed by lingering media who recognized a developing story when they saw one. His dignified departure, refusing to comment to reporters, but walking with obvious pride intact, only enhanced his growing reputation as a man of principle. The aftermath unfolded over the following days and weeks with the relentless intensity that only major royal scandals can generate. Morrison's military service record was examined and found to be exemplary. His colleagues came forward to describe him as a dedicated professional who genuinely cared about the royal family he protected. Public opinion polls showed overwhelming support for Morrison's actions and widespread criticism of Camilla's treatment of Charlotte. The incident crystallized many people's existing doubts about Camilla's fitness for her royal role and raised serious questions about her relationship with William's children. Morrison himself maintained dignified silence about the incident, refusing lucrative media offers and declining to elaborate on his motivations. His only public statement was brief and focused. He had acted according to his conscience and his duty to protect those who needed protection. The long-term consequences rippled through the royal family for months. Camilla was forced to undergo extensive media training and counseling about appropriate behavior with children. Her public appearances were carefully managed and monitored. The incident had permanently damaged her reputation and raised questions about her judgment under pressure. Charlotte, with the resilience of childhood, recovered more quickly than the adults around her. However, the incident had taught her important lessons about standing up for herself and recognizing when adults were behaving inappropriately. Her relationship with Camilla never fully recovered, remaining formal and distant even years later. Morrison's career in royal protection ended, but his actions had established a new precedent about the limits of royal authority. His 9 words had reminded everyone that protecting children from adult cruelty transcends all other considerations, including royal protocol and institutional hierarchy. The garden party that was meant to celebrate children's charity had instead become a defining moment about the values that should guide those in positions of power. Morrison's courage in speaking truth to power had protected not just Princess Charlotte, but the integrity of the institution he had sworn to serve. In the end, the incident revealed that sometimes the most important royal duty is knowing when to break royal rules in service of higher principles. Captain Morrison's 9 words had done more than defend a crying child. They had defended the idea that kindness and protection should always triumph over pride and protocol.